Good evening and welcome. My name is Mark Guerin. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics. We're delighted to welcome you to the JFK Jr. Forum, very first forum of the spring semester. And we warmly welcome all returning students, community members, faculty, and staff. This is an exciting semester, and we have a very fine forum lined up this evening. Since 1978, the JFK Jr. Forum has really been, this forum has been an important venue, a premier venue at Harvard for important discourse and conversation and dialogue. And that will continue this important semester, where our mission to inspire students to public service and politics and the public good could not be more relevant or more important at this time in our nation's civic life. So tonight, we've asked our senior fellow, Dan Balz, to moderate a session which we consider some of the issues that have happened during the break: the insurrection, the impeachment, and inauguration, three I's, if you will. And we put together a panel who will be introduced by our student leaders, but they bring expertise in law and politics, certainly, and journalism to bring to bear from their unique perspective, a firsthand account at the insurrection, the producer of the inauguration, and a legal expert on impeachment. So we are fortunate this semester in this calendar year to have the leadership, the great leadership of a new president and vice president at the Institute of Politics. We've asked them to introduce and welcome our guests in this semester. Manat Banasi is the student president, and Kevin Balin, the vice president. They are both members of the class of 2022. So I thank them for their leadership and all of the energy that they have brought in previous roles at the Institute of Politics. And with excitement for their new roles as president and vice president, I introduce Manat and Kevin. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the kind introduction. We're so excited to be here. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum for our first forum of the new year. Like Mark said, my name is Manat Banasi. I'm a junior at Harvard. I study economics, modern Middle Eastern studies, and Arabic, and newly serving as the president of the IOP. For this new year, all of us at the IOP are really looking forward to creating an IOP that will meet the moment, that will bring everyone to the table, and that will really make an impact for the rest of the year.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin Balin. I'm a junior at Harvard from Boston studying sociology, and I serve as the vice president of the IOP. On behalf of student leadership at the IOP, we could not be more excited for the spring semester. There has never been a better time to get involved in politics, particularly for young people, and the IOP has so many opportunities for students to get plugged in. It has been quite a start to the new year, and that is why we are here today. Even in this virtual setting, the forum continues to be the premier venue for discourse and dialogue, especially when we have a big question on our hands like what just happened. In just the last couple of weeks, we have seen insurrection, impeachment, and the inauguration, all amidst our global pandemic. Young people from all political ideologies, both here at Harvard and across the country, are feeling mixed emotions of outrage, fear, and hope.
To help us digest this historic month, we have a panel of participants who had behind-the-scenes views of these historic events. Tonight, we have HuffPost senior political reporter Igor Bobic, who oversees HuffPost coverage of politics and public policy in Washington, D.C., and was in the Capitol during the insurrection earlier this month, and filmed Capitol Hill police officer Eugene Goodman holding back the mob just steps away from the Senate chamber. We have Biden-Harris inauguration executive producer and longtime friend of the IOP as a residential fellow in fall of 2009, Stephanie Cutter, to share the planning behind an inauguration day like no other. And we have legal scholar, editor-in-chief of Lawfare, and senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, Ben Wittes, who will explain the unprecedented second impeachment of former President Trump. Our conversation tonight will be moderated by chief correspondent at the Washington Post and senior fellow at the IOP, Dan Balz. We'll hand it over to you, Dan.
Manat and Kevin, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you in this virtual space for the start of the new semester. Hopefully by the end of the semester, we'll all be in a better place than we've been for the last year. For those of you who on New Year's Eve said 2021 will be a much quieter year than 2020, you obviously didn't bargain for what happened in January. If this were a book, we would be calling it 3 Wednesdays in January, and the subtitle is Mark and Manat have said is Insurrection, Impeachment, and Inauguration, or Attack, Accountability, and Transition. We have, as been noted already, 3 really good people to talk about this, and I'm thrilled to basically just turn it over to them and let them roll with it. Normally, I would mix up the questions one to one and then one to another, but I think I want to go sequentially on this, and therefore I want to start obviously with the events on January 6th in the Capitol, and then we'll march through the month, and then you know, in a half hour we'll open it up to questions to all of you, and come with everything you've got on those. We look forward to that. Igor, you look like you are sitting in the Capitol at this point, which is appropriate because you were in the Capitol on the 6th. I'd like you to take us inside that moment, and particularly when it was clear to you that the story you had come to cover, which was the counting of the electoral vote and the ratification of the president and vice president, turned into something much more alarming and horrifying. So walk us through sort of how that played out.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Pleasure to do this. I am currently, as you mentioned, sitting in my seat where I was sitting on January 6th, covering the electoral vote certification, which happens to be just under my feet. I'm on the 3rd floor of the Senate and right above the Senate chamber itself. And, you know, along with other colleagues of mine, we were up here tracking the debate in the Senate chamber, specifically Ted Cruz's objection to Biden's electoral victory. And really had no idea that what my day was going to turn into. You know, I think I took a photo earlier in the day and posted to Twitter saying something like, oh man, it's going to be a long day. But I just had no inkling of what was to come. You know, we were sitting up here when we heard, this is right when Ted Cruz had started speaking on the chamber floor. We heard a security alert go out across the building, telling us to stay away from windows and doors. And I knew why, because, you know, heading into the building, we had seen some Trump supporters. Not an unusual thing to see around the Capitol. You know, we've covered many protests around the Capitol itself. Had a feeling of safety and security and comfort knowing the Capitol Police were there, were going to protect us because they had always done so. You know, it wasn't until I had taken a look outside of one of the windows right to my right and seen down to the first floor right outside the Senate that there were people gathered there. It was an unusual sight. I've never seen people gathered that close to the building, and it was my first kind of realization that something was amiss, and yet still wasn't worried whatsoever. You know, we had a staffer come by telling us if there's a breach in the building, the first security protocol is we all get locked into the Senate chamber. And I kind of blew it off. I thought, I'm going to keep covering, I'm going to keep doing my job. And this didn't really come into my head that, you know, that these guys were actually going to make it into the building. Until I heard, actually, Dan, one of your colleagues, Paul Kane, kind of whizzed through the press gallery screaming, and I'm never going to forget it. He was screaming, "Mike Pence just left the chamber. Mike Pence just left the chamber." And that was my first, you know, my first like jerk. And that's where things just kind of got rolling, because the only reason why Mike Pence would leave the chamber is if something was wrong. He was currently presiding on the day in the Senate chamber itself. And that's when I ran out of the press gallery and started running down the stairs. And, you know, if you've seen that video of Officer Goodman, it's kind of what you don't see before that is me sort of in advance pulling out my iPhone and thinking in the back of my head, I remember thinking, I knew there was something at the bottom of those stairs. I heard yelling. I didn't know what it was going to be, but I just started recording in advance, knowing that there was going to be something waiting at the bottom of those stairs, not knowing what it was going to be. And really, that was the first time I had a oh shit moment in my head. Oh my God, there's people inside the Capitol who shouldn't be here.
Tell us about the Goodman video, which obviously went viral, but describe what he was doing as you captured it so well.
You know, it's interesting. Much has been said about his heroic conduct, but really in the moment, I had no idea, and it wasn't clear to any of us what he really did until days later when we found out that the Senate chamber itself, with all 100 senators in there and the vice president, wasn't sealed at the time that Officer Goodman was only steps away downstairs, holding off, delaying this mob of rioters of forcing their way up to the second floor of the Senate, where the Senate chamber is. So you see him in the video actually, not keeping his weapon holstered, trying to keep at bay this crowd. That not really working, and he's got his little radio and he's screaming second floor, second floor. He's trying to be as unspecific as possible. He's not saying they're in the Senate or they're close to the Senate to not give away any kind of positioning. And when they finally reach the second floor, you kind of see him look left and inspect whether the Senate has been sealed itself. And at that point, he kind of pushes the lead rioter to kind of get his attention and get him to follow him in the other direction. So he really led away this mob in what could have been disaster. And as I said, I didn't know at the time of taking this video. This was 2:14 p.m. when the rioters came up the stairs. The Senate itself was sealed at 2:15. So if he didn't delay their progress, who knows what would have happened if they got into this chamber and they were screaming, where's Mike Pence? Where's Mike Pence? They later built gallows to hang people, assumedly. I don't know. We were so close to a nightmare.
So what did you do after that?
After that, I stuck with it. Personally, myself, I was kind of locked out of the chamber because, as I said, protocol maintains that everybody, senators, staff, reporters, if there's a breach, gets stuffed into the chamber itself, locked. It's the most secure place in the building. Because I ran downstairs, got locked out. And, later on, I had gone back upstairs, searching for doors, places to hide. Everything was locked. So in that moment, I just said, F it, I'm going to go record this. I took photos, I took videos, I followed these guys into the public galleries where your tourists would look at what was going on the floor as they made their way in and rappelled down. And, one guy got up onto the day where Mike Pence was sitting only minutes before, started screaming, Trump won that election. They were jubilant. They were saying, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, I've never been here. This is ours. This belongs to us. If we don't do this, democracy will go down. And that was kind of the warped reality there. They genuinely felt that this was a patriotic act of what they were doing. What
personal danger did you feel for yourself? What physical threats did you sense? How nervous were you when you realized that you were locked out of safer spaces and you were, in a sense, kind of on your own? Obviously, reporters cover wars and cover riots and things like that, but you were in the middle of that. What were you thinking about in terms of your own personal safety versus covering the story?
Down with Officer Goodman, what really kind of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was just seeing him struggling to keep them at bay and how alarmed he was. And that made me worry a little and like say in the back of my head that I shouldn't be here, but instinct just sort of kicked in and I stuck with him. Afterwards, while these mobs were going door to door screaming, where are they? I realized that I didn't look like one of them. I didn't have Trump flags. I'm wearing a suit jacket. I had a press badge. At one point, they started asking me if I knew where the senators were. One guy asked me for, directions to go to the bathroom, and I just kind of pointed him to a direction, not knowing where it was, and hoping to stay as unassuming as possible. A lot of the people who were in the building looked like your run-of-the-mill Trump supporters. I've covered many a Trump rally, and I felt comfortable covering that rally, even though, all the rhetoric about the media and charge rhetoric. And there was a point in time where, I went into the chamber with them, and there were no police officers, nobody else that I felt like this could be bad. I know that a colleague of mine, a New York Times photographer, was assaulted. They threw her down on the ground and stole her camera, stole her press badge. When she later sought help from the police didn't believe her because she didn't have her press badge. So they, threatened her. And I mean, there's so many different ways this could have gone wrong. But I don't know what to tell you. I was extremely lucky. It could have gone completely opposite direction.
Well, one last question. What's your lasting image of the day from all that you witnessed?
I witnessed the Senate, the insurrection in the Senate. I wasn't in the House. Obviously, people in the House had a far, even more harrowing experience, I think. Somebody was shot, first of all. But to me, the symbolism of this rioter carrying a Confederate flag outside the Senate chamber itself was the most visceral thing, that it just made me so outraged standing there. I mean, not even during the Civil War had Confederates flown their flag outside in the Capitol and even in Congress. And that image is seared into my brain. And, I'm still so mad that these guys who were, broadcasting these videos to the even more extremists all around the country get to call this a victory now.
Yeah, I think that image is burned in everybody's memory from that day, that the photo of that flag being carried in the middle of the Capitol just left everybody with a sick feeling. So, Igor, thank you very much. We'll get to you with questions from the students in a bit. Ben, I'll turn to you next, even though impeachment is still going on. But it was the second Wednesday of the month, and I guess I wanted to start with the question of, was there any recourse for House Democrats other than to proceed as rapidly as they could with impeachment?
Well, I suppose it depends what you mean by recourse, right? Recourse for what? Look, if the question is, what is the constitutional mechanism contemplated for a president who stokes a mob against the legislature, certainly the answer to that is impeachment. If the question is, are there other possible remedies? I think the answer is yes. You could imagine the invocation of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which deals with people who have sworn an oath to the United States who then engage in some type of insurrection. It was passed, of course, in connection with the Civil War, but it has a very plausible application here. You can also imagine a remedy in the form of criminal penalties after the president leaves office, which is, of course, only a few days. But of course, for that, you have to imagine a Justice Department that can actually make a criminal case, which is tricky because of the First Amendment dimensions of the fact that what Trump largely did was gave a speech, which is a very heavily protected area of the law, of course. And you also have to imagine that that's not a remedy that's available to the legislature as such, right? It's something that the executive branch of the subsequent administration would have to do. So if you imagine yourself as a Democrat, say Jamie Raskin, who seems to have taken the lead on this, I don't think there's a remedy. There's not an obvious, clear remedy that you can implement quickly as a legislator other than impeachment.
In that period, as the impeachment article was being prepared and sent to the floor, and as the debate on that proceeded, and perhaps in the immediate days after, I think there was a sense that the Senate might be in play.
Yes.
And clearly that's no longer the case. How do you analyze what happened in those succeeding days to change the climate on this?
So I would actually defer to you two on this, Igor as somebody and you as somebody who have covered politics and the Senate in particular over a long period of time. But my instinct is that what happened was that Mitch McConnell saw a potential opportunity to neutralize Trump permanently. And he tested the waters in his caucus and was prepared to, if there were potentially 17 votes, to put down a flag and get over, from the 14 to 18, right? And there aren't. And so he tested that water, and he is not going to be the 7th of 9 votes, right? But he might have been the 16th of 20 votes. And so he tested it publicly. A bunch of other people floated things publicly, including Kevin McCarthy, right, that the president was to blame, which he then walked back. And as the Republican caucus in both houses regressed to the mean being quite strident and unwavering support for the president with a small number of defectors, the leadership, which was, prepared bravely to lead them if they wanted to go to a different place, is not prepared to be isolated the way Liz Cheney was. And I think what happened is, over a few days, we saw that there was an offer by McConnell to go there if the caucus wanted to, and then a realization that the caucus actually wasn't close to wanting to go there, and then a retreat by McConnell in response. And the result is the vote the other day where, 45 Republican senators vote for the awesomely improbable proposition that if the president had literally shot Mike Pence, had joined and had personally shot Mike Pence in the head, or had hanged him himself, that would not be a basis for Congress to do anything.
Can you pick up on that and just go through the constitutionality of that question, which is, can a former president be tried and convicted once he is out of office?
Yeah, so it's actually a slightly complicated question, because the text of the Constitution alone would seem to favor the position, or at least seem to tolerate the position that the Republicans are taking. So there are basically 4 provisions in the Constitution that mention impeachment, right? There's the delegation to the House as having the sole power of impeachment. There is the delegation to the Senate of having the sole power to try all impeachments. Those are kind of the jurisdictional statements. There is the statement that punishment in cases of impeachment shall not exceed removal from office and disqualification from further holding of office. And then finally, there is the famous statement in Article 2 that the president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment and conviction. There's also a reference to judges serving during good behavior, which is understood to be saying as long as they're not impeached. And so people look at that statement and say, well, okay, the president shall be removed if he's impeached and convicted. He's not the president anymore, so you can't try him. And he can't be removed, of course. The problem with that reading is that it does imply that the president can commit any impeachable offense in the last days of his presidency with no consequence. If you think about the implications of that, they're quite breathtaking. My example is only one crazy one that you could come up with. And so the traditional understanding, which is somewhat tentative, has been that the power of impeachment does not go away when the person leaves office. And there was a Secretary of then we called Secretary of War in the aftermath of the Civil War, who was impeached, went to President Grant and resigned, and the Senate maintained the right to try him anyway. So the traditional practice has not favored this viewpoint. It is a plausible one textually. It just doesn't work structurally, and it's not the way the Senate has historically understood its role.
Yeah. Let me ask you one last question, then we'll turn to Stephanie. You mentioned this yesterday when we were all talking about this, but I'd like you to raise it in this forum, which is, in a sense, how have the Trump impeachments and perhaps the Clinton impeachment changed your view of what impeachment means as a tool of accountability?
Yeah, so it's changed it very profoundly. I mean, so when I was growing up, which is in the post-Watergate era, we had two examples of impeachment. The actual impeachment of Andrew Johnson. This is presidential impeachment, that is. The actual impeachment of Andrew Johnson, which is unsuccessful, but was really successful in the sense that he's acquitted by the Senate. He leaves office in disgrace a few months later, and he is understood to be among the 2 or 3 worst presidents in history, as you know, and the only one who has actually been impeached. And then there's the impeachment of Richard Nixon, which did not take place because and only because the impeachment power was so dramatic that he resigned in anticipation of it. And so you have this understanding of impeachment as this completely ruinous thing for a president. It is unsurvivable, either because you get convicted in the Senate or because you leave office in disgrace as a result of resignation, or even if you survive it, you don't really survive it. And then Bill Clinton comes along. Now, I don't want to get into a debate about whether the Clinton impeachment was merited or not, or a good idea or a bad idea, et cetera. Bill Clinton survived it. Just as an objective matter, he survived it, and it plays a relatively small role when people talk about the legacy of the Clinton administration. It's kind of a footnote that, oh, by the way, he got impeached and there were a lot of scandals, but it's actually not that big a part of the way people talk about Bill Clinton. So that stands for this weird idea that you can actually survive an impeachment, and it's a part of who you are, but it's not a very big part. So then in a relatively short period of time, and in in American history, 20 years is a very short period of time, Donald Trump is then impeached twice. And he will survive both of those impeachments. And so what do the Trump impeachments and Bill Clinton's impeachment have in common? And what they really have in common is that a certain amount of party discipline is actually all you need. Like Nixon turns out to have been a sucker. All he really needed to do was hold the Republican Party together. And we didn't understand that until, I mean, Clinton gave a little bit of a hint of it, but what Trump has done is really shown that the impeachment as a mechanism of accountability doesn't work in the face of genuine partisan polarization. And that's something I think the founders did not anticipate. It's certainly not the way they wrote about impeachment. The idea that party government would be stronger than the institutional prerogatives of the different branches was not something they had a particularly strong sense of. And it's not clear to me what plays the role that impeachment is imagined to play if, you know, all you need are 34 senators who are loyal to you irrespective of good or ill, right or wrong, and you can kind of survive anything. And I think that's a real challenge that, you know, those of us who kind of came of age in the post-Watergate era really did not imagine ourselves facing and didn't really give a lot of thought to, and we have to now.
Ben, thank you. That's a sobering way to close out the discussion on impeachment. Stephanie, You reinvented political conventions last summer, and then you got the call that you had to reinvent an inauguration this time. And I'm wondering whether your initial reaction was not again, or I've got this. But you obviously had two big challenges. One was COVID, doing it in the middle of a pandemic, and then along came the attack on the Capitol, and you had security issues. Start first with, where you began the process of thinking through the inauguration and how you thought about it. What were the challenges of putting it together?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to join the IOP, and you, Dan. We knew that we would be producing this in the middle of a pandemic, and we had just done it was the same team that did the convention. We got the crew back together to do the inauguration. So we didn't even presume there would be any crowds anywhere. And as you know, there was a small crowd at the Capitol for the swearing in, but beyond that, there was very little footprint in terms of people in Washington. We spent a lot of time at the beginning of the process communicating to donors and supporters and elected officials and everybody across the country. Do not travel to Washington. There will not be anything for you to attend, so that we could just tamp that down and keep, safety front of mind. After we got that message out, then we started thinking, okay, so what can it be? And then how do we pull people in from where they are and allow them to participate? And that's really where we started building. From everything from the day of service on Monday to the COVID memorial on Tuesday, the swearing in on Wednesday, the parade across America, and then the Celebrating America event that night at the Lincoln. Even at the Lincoln, our footprint was very, very small because of the pandemic. Now, because of that, after the insurrection, there was concern about safety. Particularly for our crews and people. I live in Washington. There's not much that you get rattled by here, though listening to Igor talk through what he went through is a bit rattling. But we had hundreds of people traveling here to produce these shows. And there was a lot of nervousness about it. And there was nervousness for the small number of talent that we were asking to come here. So that was what we had to work through to make people feel safe to participate in a presidential inauguration, which is startling that you even have to say that. Everybody on the podium that day for the swearing in, to the small number of talent that were coming live to the Lincoln Memorial to perform. We worked very closely with Secret Service, who were amazing in putting protocols together and moving up the dates at which the city would lock down. But because we already had that small footprint as a result of the pandemic, there weren't that many changes that needed to be made other than making sure there was comfort.
Two follow-up questions on this. One, what did the experience of doing the convention, how much easier did that make it to do this one? And second, were there things you thought about trying to do that you just weren't able to do, whether for either security reasons or for the pandemic reasons?
It did make it easier that we had gone through this for the convention. The convention was 4 nights and hundreds of segments that we had to produce. And just having been through that and lots of trial and error and a better understanding of what's going to keep an audience in an environment like this in an all virtual program, we knew where we had to start. The only thing that changed was the limited number of days, but also thinking creatively, if you can't have inaugural balls, what do you do? What is the substitute for that? If you can't have an audience to fill them all up for the swearing in, what do you do so people aren't staring at frozen tundra during the swearing in? And also people feel like there's a piece of them there. They are part of that ceremony. So the creative process was different. The implementation of it was largely the same. There were lots of things that we wanted to do that we weren't able to pull off. Some because of security concerns, some because of COVID concerns. I will say the transition, and which is no surprise because this is how they ran the campaign and how they are leading in the White House, were very serious about maintaining the strictest COVID protocols. And we had to live within that. And that affected everything from how you produce segments, the number of crew members you have on site. You know, I mean, I was producing segments which, you know, that I really had no business doing. So it was more logistical things that prevented us, logistical things because of the pandemic or security that prevented us from doing a few things. Like, you know, we wanted to have segments that were taking place at iconic locations all over the city, but also all over America, to sort of wrap your arms around that this was an American moment. This was, you know, one of our greatest moments. You know, that's what inaugurations are. Not from a partisan standpoint, but from a just a democracy standpoint. But because of the situations that I've just outlined, we had to shrink that very much to largely the Lincoln and of course the White House.
I must say the mall was beautiful with the flags. I mean, it was stunning, and obviously the Wednesday night event, not just with the talent you had, but that unbelievable fireworks display at the end. You obviously bought every piece of fireworks available in America and probably overseas. One last question for you, and then we'll turn to the students, and that is just briefly, you know, you showed that conventions don't need long speeches, and you showed that Inauguration Day doesn't need inaugural balls. What will be lasting from the experiences of what we have seen both at the convention and the inauguration in the way they've been reimagined?
You know, I want to preface that by saying it's really up to whoever the candidate is and whoever the president is. Those are the people that will make those decisions. However, I think the way that we had produced these two programs, the convention and the inauguration, allowed so many more people to participate and feel part of it. You didn't have to, you know, have an inside game to get a ticket to to sit on the floor to watch a speech. You didn't have to spend thousands of dollars for a ticket to the inauguration and stand in, you know, long lines and high heels and lose your coat. You could sit on your couch and feel just as much a part of it. And I think there are a lot of people that are going to choose that over the other. I also think from, you know, somebody like me, my perspective in terms of message delivery and message discipline and connecting with the American people, you can be so much more disciplined and attuned with what people are looking for through doing events like this. You know, but I'm a realist. It's not always going to be possible. And so, you know, maybe there will be some sort of a hybrid situation for both of them in the future. Who knows?
Well, one would assume that if you have any input into the next one, there will be more of the new rather than the old. But thank you to all three of you. We'll now go to questions from the students. Ask all the students to say A, where they're calling in from. B, as you know, keep the question short and end with a question mark. First up is Ryan. Ryan, go ahead.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us this evening. My question is kind of along the lines of discussion about accountability. We've seen a really hectic month, especially with the Capitol riots and the insurrection. And I think one of the unique things about what we saw on January 6th was the act of enabling within Congress. The assistance from congressmen, congresswomen in aiding these rioters. I'm from Colorado. I'm from the college. I'm a freshman, but I'm from Colorado, and one of our congresswomen, Congresswoman Boebert, was actively tweeting Nancy Pelosi's location. So my question to y'all is, how do you suggest we hold these people accountable for actively undermining our democratic institutions in this way? And how can we make that accountability substantial enough so that this doesn't happen again?
Ben, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Broadly speaking, there are, I think, 4 possible mechanisms of accountability. I think the least plausible one is a criminal mechanism. A bunch of people are getting arrested. You would have to, the FBI would have to have pretty compelling evidence of a congressman or woman's direct involvement in the violence or misconduct to treat it as a criminal matter, but it's theoretically there. And I do think there are some people, particularly if the allegations that people were giving recognizance tours are true or proved to be true, you know, people who had foreknowledge of what was being planned and may have played some role in planning, I think you could imagine that reaching criminal mechanisms, although I'm skeptical of that. The second area is, you know, discipline by the House or Senate itself. And, you know, there have been particularly with respect to Marjorie Taylor Greene, there has been suggestions or a motion for expulsion, which, you know, they may be able to force a vote on, but you could imagine remedies short of that, like a censure resolution, et cetera, and the House has been known to do that sometimes. The third is that I do think we are very likely to see major investigations of this in a non-criminal setting, whether it's a commission, sort of 9/11 type commission, or just serial congressional hearings. And I do think one group of people that would be very, very angry at members who misbehaved in this way are other members whose lives were put at risk as a result of it. And I do think there's a desire to expose some of that. So those are not direct consequences, but they are exposure. And then the third element, the final element, which is, I think, a bigger deal for senators than it is for members of the House, who tend to have very safe districts, is, you know, electoral retribution. And, you know, it's clearly put Josh Hawley in a pretty difficult position. And I think that picture that, you know, of him with his fist in the air in front of the protesters, you know, relatively shortly before they entered the Capitol, is going to be the stuff of thousands and thousands of Lincoln Project and Democratic ads between now and the next time he runs for office. And so I think there are multiple levels of possible accountability. But, you know, for some of them, particularly the ones in the safest districts, a lot of them are they're all going to fail. And, you know, we're going to have members of Congress who, to one degree or another, materially participated in this.
Great. Next up is Mina. Hi, Mina.
Hi, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'm Mina. I'm a senior here at the college. Thank you so much for being here. And Igor, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for that video. That was really powerful. My question is for you, but anyone can answer. I guess if you were an elected official in the Republican Party now, or kind of looking through that lens, what do you think or suspect that Trump's influence on the GOP will be going forward. There's been talk of a Patriot Party forming as kind of a third party, and he's still having disproportionate influence, like with Matt Gaetz today going to Casper to rally against Liz Cheney. Do you think that there will continue to be these types of rallies and events that kind of evince support of Trump, or will that kind of fade out?
Thanks for your question, Mina. I think it's really, really good question. And I think that question right now is coloring all the next, I would say, months to years, especially in the Republican Party, is not just what is Trump going to do, but more importantly, I think, is what are his voters, what are his supporters going to do? And I think Republican senators are more afraid of what his supporters are how they're going to be viewed in a potential primary in future elections. And you really have two camps of Republican senators right now, those who don't see much of a future for themselves in the Republican Party anymore and are hitting the eject button. You know, people like Rob Portman, who are very well respected, very smart legislators, but you know, announced their retirement. They're getting out of Washington. They don't see a future for themselves in the party. And I think Republicans to some degree are in delusion. I think it's Trump's party. It's not their party, as much as they're trying their best to kind of rally around. And that's why you're seeing more and more lower elected official Republicans like Taylor Greene and, you know, the Hollies, the Ted Cruzes, who are echoing Trump's language, and more of the sort of, you know, bipartisan stalwart centrists leaving Congress. So the Senate of the future, and the Senate already, looks completely different from the Senate that we had even a couple of years ago, where you had, you know, these well-respected bipartisan people who wanted to make a deal. So I think it's a really, really good question, one to watch going forward.
Great, thank you. Next, Hannah.
Hi there. So my name's Hannah. I'm a first year at the college, currently zooming in from campus, but originally from Missouri, so Holly territory. But I have a question for Stephanie regarding basically just how COVID shaped the Democratic National Convention and inauguration this year, and anything that you'd like to elaborate on that process.
Well, you know, at the beginning of the planning for the convention, nobody really knew how long we would be in the pandemic, right? We started planning in the spring for an August, well, then a July convention. We moved it back a month, thinking that month would give us some space. And then we realized that wasn't going to be enough. So then we went to a hybrid formula where, you know, some the delegates would be in Wisconsin, but, you know, donors and others, the typical tens of thousands of people that descend on a city would not be. And we would restrict events and have protocols, and people would take their temperature and things like that. That quickly became untenable. And about a month before, we ended up making it mostly virtual. There were a few people in Wisconsin speaking from the Wisconsin stage, but primarily it was virtual. So, you know, we knew early on that some of our content would have to be pre-recorded, just because there are hundreds of segments over 4 nights, and you can't do that live. And I spent a lot of time talking to some of the producers who had been producing shows through COVID, like Global Citizen and the NFL Draft and things like that, to just walk through how they sequenced it. You know, we quickly realized that we had to shrink the time. We went to 2 hours a night rather than the 5 to 7 hours, depending upon which year you're talking about, and it all virtual. About half of the content time was live, and about half of the content time was pre-recorded. So, you know, we shifted quickly and had to figure out how to do it and how to get all of those shoots done in time, and how to do the roll call, because we couldn't have those delegates present. But then how do you make that roll call interesting? So there was a creative process involved too that you don't normally even think about for a roll call. And it was all about keeping people tuned in, and because for politically, a convention is really important in terms of setting the narrative for the fall, and credentialing your candidate, not necessarily for a bounce, but for the attributes that allow you to have a strong fall. So we needed to keep people tuned in so we could achieve that goal. So that's where the creativity came in. That's where the short segments came in, because who wants to listen to a politician speak for 10 minutes as you're looking at your computer? I mean, people would just shut down. That nobody knew what to expect. I think we surprised people with what it was. People thought they would just be looking at Zoom screens. And then we took those learnings to the inaugural. We obviously had much more notice for the inauguration in terms of that it would have to be virtual, that we were still very much in the pandemic and were entering some of the worst months. What we didn't know is that we would have such a short time to plan it because of the election, that it dragged out, and in terms of getting security access, and even just discussions with what's called the JSIC, which is the Joint Committee for the Inauguration in Congress. It was hard for them to have discussions with us because there was no president-elect. So that time was shrunk because of the politics of it, but because we had already been through this for the inauguration, we were able to put a lot of those learnings in place quickly. Again, the creative process was very different, but one impact of excuse me, I have a little visitor here. One impact of the pandemic that is just worth thinking about is, how do you have an inauguration where you're celebrating a new president when so many people are suffering? And so just creatively, what do you need to do to sort of open people's minds that it's okay to feel good about where we are? I felt very strongly that we had to do a COVID memorial the day before the inauguration to get some of that, emotion on the table. And it had never been done before. And I will tell you, the one thing that I hear from people most of all of those inaugural events is that COVID memorial. Because they could just breathe a sigh of relief that we can now nationally collectively mourn. And excuse me, sorry. And then for Inauguration Day, typically inaugurations are about celebrating a new president. And of course, that was part of our process and what we wanted to do, but we also felt like it was important to celebrate the American people and the strength and perseverance of the American people, given what they had gone through over the past year, both economically, but also with tremendous loss. If you just look at our messaging, it was very much about that and lifting up those heroes, the frontline workers, the medical workers, the people who were just contributing to their communities. Sorry. And those were strung through the entire night and very much connected to a performance. So while we had great performances and great artists performing, they were always tied to one of those stories with their performance specifically curated to be part of that. So anyway, some of those creative thoughts were very much impacted by the pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ujay.
Hi, my name is Ajay. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College, and I'm calling in today from Jacksonville, Florida. So my question, and basically directed to anyone who would like to answer it, is in the lead up to the insurrection on January 6th, a lot of the rhetoric we know now that was going on apps, especially like Parler, was not only just violent, but had a clear white supremacist bent to it. Almost immediately after the events of January 6th, something many members of the media pointed out was that the response to, say, Black Lives Matter protests in Lafayette Park over the summer was completely disproportionate when compared to the response to what occurred on January 6th. So my question to you all, especially as people who followed the government, is do you feel that this event may be sort of a shifting, maybe mark a shifting in how our government thinks about white supremacy as a threat directly to national security, or if you feel like this will mark some sort of shift in how our government chooses to address those threats?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. So first of all, the government has already been shifting on this, and there was an incident over the early fall in which the Department of Homeland Security, for the first time, identified analytically white supremacist violence as the #1 domestic terrorism threat. And this, they got a lot of pressure from the political echelon on that point. And I actually released successive drafts of the document to show how it had been somewhat watered down, but it did actually remain in there. And the FBI, Chris Wray, has talked about this pretty frankly. And so the leadership of law enforcement, even under the Trump administration, and in the face of the president's own lack of comfort with the findings, shall we say, has been relatively direct on this point. That said, the answer to your question is yes. The Capitol Police were woefully unprepared for this. Had there been comparable Black Lives Matter, to use your example, or left-oriented protesters who had spent the previous several days saying, let's storm the Capitol, there would have been a much better prepared, people would have taken it more seriously. We can talk all day about why that is, but I think I think the results speak for themselves, honestly. There's good news on this front, which is that the last time the FBI decided it was time to penetrate the Ku Klux Klan and do something about it, the penetration was extremely rapid and almost completely successful. And so this is, domestic groups are compared to some of the other targets that we have worked with in recent years in the counterterrorism space. These are relatively easy targets in some ways for a lot of reasons that I don't want to bore you with, but they're, a significant focus on these groups, I think will actually be devastating to them.
Good. We have reached the magic moment of 7 p.m. And so I know there are more questions that people would like to ask, but unfortunately we have promised everybody that we would wrap up at 7. So for those of you who did not get to ask a question, our apologies to you, and save your energies for another forum, because there'll be plenty of them through the spring semester. Thank you to Stephanie and Ben and Igor. This was really terrific. We covered a lot of ground tonight. I think we all learned a lot from each of you. So we are indebted to you for participating, and to all of the students who were involved in this, and both from the IOP Executive Committee and from those of you who are watching. Thank you. We'll see you at a future forum. Good night to everybody.
Thank you.